Hey there, Postal here. So today we've got ourselves a real treat. Myself, VeeBat, and Avolation sat down and discussed an entire line. In this instance, we discussed the entire Mustang line, the American light fighter line. Obviously, the Mustangs are the most iconic planes on that particular line, but it ends with the F-86 Sabre. So I'm really excited to showcase this particular video, as we do literally go and discuss every plane that's available in the game, and discuss why we enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, and talk about some best practices, some things that we found successful, some things that we try to avoid doing as well. I'm really proud of this video. I hope it still hasn't been finished editing yet, but I hope it comes to fruition the way that I feel like it will in my mind. I definitely enjoyed the discussion time that I had with Avolation and V. I know it's a little bit on the longer side, but it's a lot longer than a normal video of any of ours. But I hope you appreciate the time, the effort, and the passion that we put into this video. You can actually see VeeBat's version of the video and Avolation's version of the video on their respective channels. The link to each of those channels is in my description below. But otherwise, let's go ahead and roll right into the video.
Hey guys, VeeBat here with another V-Plays, and I'm joined by...
Hey, this is Postal Monkey.
And Avolation.
So, recently a viewer gave a suggestion that it would be nice to see like a tech tree showcase of a particular line of aircraft. Maybe not the nationality but in particular, but like a total aircraft line run from, say, the P-12 all the way down to the F-86 Sabre, highlighting the American altitude fighters. And that's exactly what we're going to do today, because as I was thinking about it, I thought it made a lot more sense to bring in two other content contributors that can bring something to the table besides just my own perspective. So Postal and Avolation are joining me today, and hopefully all three of us will be able to post this video together so that way you can see it on our channels. So just to start out, I think we got to start with the P-12, just because that's the intro to all the American fighters, even though it's only a multi-role compared to the traditional fighters. So any thoughts, guys, on the P-12, the American Tier 1?
It's been a hot minute since I've hopped in the P-12, but I do like, especially at the lower tiers, the multi-roles tend to be a little bit more flexible, since they've got the maneuverability of a lot of the fighters. So if I was going to be keeping a tier 1, I would keep a multi-role, and this is a solid all-around plane at this tier.
Avolation?
I would tend to agree. I don't have a huge experience to draw on with that plane, simply because I tend to prefer sort of tier 4 and up, but
Right.
it's hard. I feel like if you want to call it the Mustang line, it's not really apparent in tier 1 as much. It really starts to come in tier 3 and 4. So it's hard to distinguish it from its peers, I feel.
I'm gonna have to agree. I think while it's important to say that this P-12 exists and you're gonna start here, all these lower tier kind of biplane aircraft are really just kind of intro to how to play the game, and I think almost all of them pretty much play the same. I mean, I did a quick run through of all the other tier 1s, and they all get some type of air to ground ordnance just to give you that feel. And with biplanes, I think, like you said, like these lower tier aircraft, they all tend to have really interesting stall characteristics that makes them more maneuverable in their own right, just to kind of make the game a little bit easier so you can get the basics.
More accessible to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's call the P-12 done, just because there isn't much to say.
Yeah.
And we're probably not going to spend a lot of time on these early tiers, but P-23. If I remember the P23 correctly, it felt fast to me when I was playing early tiers, and I thought it looked pretty sleek for a biplane.
So I gotta say, if you don't mind me jumping in here, this is
Yeah.
the only non-premium tier 2 I've actually kept in the game. I kept it because I thought it was a really good all-arounder at tier 2, and I didn't know at the time that I'd actually be so into the game as I am. It's I've looked into it quite a bit. It's not the most maneuverable. It doesn't have the best altitude performance. Its guns are right in line with everything else at tier 2. So it's kind of similar to the tier 1 in that regard, but it is really well balanced, and you can get good speed for tier 2 out of it. And
Sure.
it's just a fun little plane. It's not overpowered by any means, but I'm not really sure there's a whole lot of overpowered tier 2 planes in the game.
No, it's definitely one of the faster tier 2s, and that's really the first step towards this line distinguishing itself from the others.
I also like that it doesn't seem like much. Like, you look at the guns and you're like, okay, it's got 2 machine guns, but a 50 cal machine gun is actually quite powerful at these lower tiers, especially with just that little bit more reach, and it kind of brings the P23 up into like that next echelon. So, and again, with the biplane, it shares a lot of those same stall characteristics. So while it's not as maneuverable as your Japanese counterparts, you can get them into a stall climb and kick that rudder over pretty well with these things.
Exactly. Yep.
All right, moving on to the Hawk 75. And the first thing that appears to me when I look at the Hawk 75M just in the tech tree is the sheer volume of firepower on this thing. Like, even with the first upgrade, you're looking at a total of 6 machine guns, and one of those can be upgraded to a 50 cal. That's just a lot of firepower, and I feel like that kind of it almost gives people a false sense of firepower as you continue down the Mustang line.
Yeah, no doubt.
The Hawk 75, like, because I went back and played a bunch of these planes, of course, and the Hawk 75 was the first one that I was able to feel sort of comfortable in, compared to playing some of the higher tiers. It's a bit more familiar, it's got a bit more speed, and the distinct characteristics are starting to play out a little bit more in tier 3.
Yeah, this is where you see a pretty significant drop off on maneuverability, but you also see a decent bump up in airspeed and altitude performance. I'm glad you pointed it out, V. I didn't really. It's been a while since I played the 75M. I actually forgot about how many guns this plane had until you were re-mentioning it. I was like, yeah, I remember when I was going down this line and going from the P23, which had 3 guns, and it was perfectly adequate, and going to this plane that had a plethora of guns for the tier. I was just like, man, I can melt everything down as long as I can keep them at target.
I'm noticing it now too. The climb rate, while it's not stellar by any means compared to higher tiers, the climb rate on these aircraft is pretty good. 282 feet per second if you're working in standard measurements. But yeah, that thing, it really does have good climb rate, even though it's not, high tier climb rate. I think that's going to kind of showcase the acceleration and the ability to get itself out of trouble.
So, Avolation, I've got a quick question for you, since you've actually played this plane relatively recently. Would you keep this plane if you just as a tier 3 hanging out?
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed it, actually. And I was just playing a lot of the tier 4 P36, and I sort of enjoyed, especially as a non-spec plane in tier 3, and because you're not getting thrust up into the tier 5 battles, it's a much more viable option. Whereas when you hop into that P36 and now you've got to deal with the tier 5 guys, it's a lot tougher. So I really felt a bit of a step there between those two.
It's good to know.
Yeah, thank you. So, onto the P-36, now that you've mentioned it. The P-36 also still gets 6 machine guns, but 2 of those are going to be 50 cals now. We've already mentioned how 50 cals were really powerful at Tier 2, but it's becoming more the standard as you start to hit Tier 4 and 5. So those 7.62s are starting to fall out of favor.
Yeah.
But it does have some much more of an increase in altitude performance. So this is getting you into that echelon of what you should be expecting, I think, for a majority of the Mustang line.
And personally, I remember when I was going down this line, the P-36 was the one that I remember, like, as we were talking about doing this discussion, it was the one I remember being the step to, like, learning how to play the Mustang line. I remember it being higher altitude than a lot of the other planes that are out there. Pretty good speed, mediocre maneuverability, and just a gray area in front of you when you're firing all your machine guns. And so I remember this one being that like good segue from the lower tiers to the higher tiers. Not as far as like at the time I didn't realize it when I was first playing the game, but Tier 4 it can be kind of a beast tier. If you get stuck in those Tier 5 matches that have the upgraded bots and so I remember it was kind of, it wasn't like I guess what I'm trying to say is it could be a struggle in this plane just because when you get into a Tier 5 match it can be outclassed a little bit, but I remember it setting you up for the future pretty well.
The thing I really noticed, especially going from the Hawk to the 36, was that you're no longer on an even keel with the dogfighting. You now really have to rely on your altitude and your speed and capitalize and do your dives and just bug out. You can't get into turn fights with the zeros or anything, and the BF-109s will outturn you as well. So they really, you really got to use that speed and altitude performance. And I actually just spent like, I don't know, almost 10 goes in a row on the P-36, really trying to sort of tap into it and figure out what's going on with it. What was I going to say now?
Well, while you're trying to sink that in, I'm gonna interject, I guess. I'm glad you brought up maneuvering with a 109, because at this tier, the Russians don't quite have their altitude fighter yet. That's not until Tier 5. But you are going up against BF-109s, and arguably the Heinkel 112. So you're looking at aircraft that sport cannons now at a pretty low tier, and that can be pretty devastating as well. And I think it goes without saying that the 109 is a hard counter in a lot of ways to the Mustang line. So it's where you start to get that feel for what you can expect for the rest of the time that you're grinding this line.
What I was trying to say was that what I really wanted to do with the P-36 was get it to spec, so that I could just chuck on those extra engine mods, because I feel like it's a plane that doesn't really come into its own until it's got that extra advantage. It's got a really high speed, top speed, that you're just not going to hit until you do those mods and get the extra boost and stuff, because you've only got 8 seconds of boost. I don't think I even, like, you've got to do a full dive with full boost to get to the top speed in that plane. Like, it's it really needs a bit of extra help, but once it gets it, it really does become very distinct from its peers.
Yeah, it is unfortunately kind of the lesser of the between this and the BF-109B. I think there's a lot of as we go down the tiers, there's a lot of times we're going to be able to say, well, the American line in this particular tier has such and such better performance. I really do think that at this particular tier, the P-36 is pretty well lacking behind the VF-109 on the opposite side. It doesn't have the even fully spec'd out. It's not quite there at the VF-109 speed. It's got less maneuverability. Its altitude performance is less. So I think this, although you're exactly right, Avolation, that this plane sets you up for the future rest of the line. If you can do well in the P-36, basically, you're going to do really well all the way up to at least tier 8 on this line. But like as far as a keeper is concerned, I'm not sure this would be a plane that I would be keeping if I was having to keep a tier 4 fighter. This probably wouldn't be it.
So what I think is kind of funny is how much more time we spent on this particular aircraft compared to the other previous ones, but it makes sense because this is the first time where you see 109s pop up and you start seeing cannon fighters, the counters come up to it, and I think it is this is kind of that moment where you're like, hey, the rest of this line is going to feel underpowered gun-wise, and that's why the American Mustang line, a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with it. Either you really love them or you absolutely hate having machine guns while everybody else gets cannons.
Yeah.
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 Yep. You're really going to notice that difference in tier 5.
It comes down to whether or not you like them. But yeah, that's a good segue. So tier 5, I don't think I've run into anybody who didn't like the P-40. Just because the P-40 is a very iconic aircraft, you know, flying tigers and all that, and you are getting the full 650 cal machine gun setup, which again, it doesn't seem like much initially until you start using it, and at tier 5 it's fairly powerful, and you start to see that speed Avolation was talking about that you wanted from the P-36. I feel like the P-40 can hold it.
Yep. As you guys probably know, that I actually jumped onto the P-40 M105 a lot more. Like when I had to make my decision of do I keep the P-40 or not, I just thought to myself, well, I've already got an M105. Why do I need the P-40? So coming back and having a look at the P-40 was interesting. It was challenging. It was more challenging than I was expecting, actually.
How so?
Well, I think again the thing that really helps the M105 is the fact that I've spec'd it to the limit, and once you get that little edge there, that is when the plane can really do its thing. Mm-hmm. And going back to a P-40, which was stock. You feel like you've been dropped down a rung for sure, and short of swapping in an experienced pilot, it was more challenging to kind of get the hang of.
Well,
but
this is where,
go ahead.
like, sorry to interrupt, but this is where you're talking on the P-36 was kind of almost basically underpowered compared to some of its counterparts. This is the first plane in the line that I feel that starts to separate itself when it comes to airspeed. It's not like ridiculously faster than the MiG-3 or the BF-109E, but it's just fast enough, and it teaches you, or it taught me anyway, if I'm able to maintain my airspeed, this plane can do wonders. And those 650 cals, although, like, okay, we're used to playing higher tier planes, 650 cals at this tier can actually do quite a bit of damage, and it's a widespread. I put universal ammunition on my 50 cal planes, and you're pretty good at starting fires in that regard. So if this plane really teaches you boom and zoom. I mean, not that you're doing a lot of boom, but you're doing a lot of zoom, and because it's really the strength of this particular plane, and I feel like it's the strength of this particular line.
Yeah. I feel like with that speed and those machine guns, if you use the speed to get close, which you can, especially if you start high and attack from there, it's easy to get close, and that is where those machine guns are really going to do their work.
See, I like this because all I have to do is intro an aircraft, and then I got you guys for the rest of the game. It's perfect. But yeah, 100% agree. It doesn't have. I recently bought this back based on request from a viewer and did another review on it. But yeah, if you don't hold your speed, you really feel it because it has an edge,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have much of an edge. And if there's a 109E that wants to get you and you're caught out, you are hard caught out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With that, let's go to the P51A because I think this is where people kind of make their decision as to whether or not they're going to keep down the line. Because the P51 is clearly a very iconic aircraft. Won't get to say the cat's meow.
Do you mind if I put my cat up real quick?
No, go right ahead.
Sorry.
So the P51's actually got weaker guns than the P40, slightly.
So
Sorry about that, guys.
No, it's
That's
fine. So the P51A, you lose 2 of the 50 kills, but
Right.
you start upgrading to arguably better 50 kills, but there's still only 4 of them, and you essentially end up having the same firepower as a P40, but with less volume. So that can make it feel more inaccurate. You start to see that airspeed start to come into its own a little bit more, but now you're facing that. You're really starting to feel that firepower disparity, and that's where I think it starts to become a bit of an issue, right? That's when you have to really decide whether or not you're going to stick with it. And I think people who like iconic American fighters, a lot of it is just historical nostalgia that you want to fly a Mustang, so you stick with it. I think it pays off later on, but this is really kind of going to be your trial by fire because the P40 felt so strong. And now you're hopping into this, and it almost feels like you're getting out-tiered firepower-wise, so you have to rely on the airframe's capabilities over just the guns.
Well,
Yeah.
and the thing with the plane itself is, yeah, it's got better airspeed than the I-210 or the BF-109F, but that's after you get the fully upgraded engine. You got to go through 3 other engines to get that top engine on the P51A. So it's like you start off kind of on the weak side. Well, not even kind of. You start off just weaker, and it takes you a little while longer to get to where you want it to be
Right.
where it should be competitively.
Yeah. It's a tougher hill to climb.
The nice thing, however, is that you are unlocking in the P51A the second engine in the P51D, so you're getting that chance to kind of get ahead on the next airframe, even though it's going to be a labor of love to get there. And I do fully advocate fully upgrading any line that you're grinding, just because you're not getting the full impression of the aircraft. Otherwise, if you're just going to say, I'm going to skip that last engine because I want to get to the P51D, I think you're going to have a much tougher slog, and I think that's good advice across the board for most aircraft. You guys have the same impression?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Because I figure if I'm grinding a full line, and you mentioned it, you know, the P51D is going to use the top engine on the P51A. It's going to make the P51D grind that much easier. And very often some of the engines and some of the guns, especially on the American and German lines, tend to crisscross. So if you don't want to skip all those different things just because it's going to help you out in the future. I like making it easier in the future.
Speaking of the future, let's talk about the P51D at Tier 7. I also recently repurchased this based on a request. And who is it? Somebody wrote in the comments, I think it actually was Prince of Hyrule or Sergeant Slaughter. He said, "Why'd you get the worst Mustang there in the game?" And
Man, that's hard.
yeah, that
That's a
is
little
harsh. The firepower goes up, but arguably it's where the A probably should have been. So you still feel underpowered, and the airspeed management becomes even more important.
Yes.
Just because you're going up against, you know, you're starting to go up against more altitude fighters, because arguably the Japanese Tier 7, the Key series, what is that, the 61? That's considered like what, the most powerful fighter at tier 7 just because of the altitude it starts to get. So you can find yourself running into a lot more nasty aircraft.
Well, I could name. I mean, I wouldn't have necessarily gone as far as Hyrule went, Schlaughter, but it's just a weak tier 7 plane, unfortunately, in my opinion. The airspeed that you can rely on at tier 6 and tier 5 to kind of save you, and even at tier 8 and above, it's kind of lacking for this tier. The BF-109, the I-220, all have at least the same airspeed, if not better, than the P-51D. And if your strength on a plane is only just as good as some strengths on other planes, and they've got better guns or they've got better maneuverability, then where is your plane at, kind of situation. So I could understand that sentiment.
Yeah. See, I must be one of these romantic Mustang lovers because I have all the Mustangs. I've spec'd them all, and I enjoy flying them perhaps more than most fighters at their tier. The thing that I think people tend to concentrate on the dogfighting, right? The competition that you've got, the high altitude with the fighters and the mid altitude with the Spitfires. But the thing that no one talks about is how great they are at taking out heavies and bombers, especially before sort of tier 7, 8, where the bombers get much better defenses.
Yeah.
They're fantastic at doing that. They've got the speed for getting around and controlling the battle in a way that, you might not be dogfighting everyone, but you're knocking out bombers, you're knocking out heavies, and you are picking off the odd Spitfire that is, turning around and going too slow. Like, if you fly it high, you just have an advantage that a lot of the other planes don't.
So you say spec it out, and I'm looking at this mine in the hangar and looking at what's currently locked without it being specialized. I have the opportunity to get an airframe upgrade, an extra engine upgrade. I get a consumable for the airframe and an extra consumable for the engine. That's a lot of stuff to unlock with specialization. Like, you're talking about 4 slots, not like the piddly 1 or 2 you might get in tiers before. So this becomes one that if you want to put the effort into it, I think it can become a really strong aircraft, like you mentioned, and it's where it starts to become more worth it, in my opinion, to specialize these aircraft, because you're going to get so much more for the bang for the buck. And sorry, I know I'm kind of stopping postal, but I want to mention this: a great example of why you need to upgrade the P-51 Alpha, because if you guys looked at the tech tree real quick, you'll note that if you upgrade the airframe, if you've already unlocked those MG53-2 guns on the P-51A, you essentially get like a free upgrade when you get to this plane. If you can get the airframe upgraded, you automatically get not only an extra 2 machine guns, but you're also getting the next grade of machine gun. Otherwise, the stock grind on this looks like it's a real bear.
Yeah, and that just kind of reinforces the need, or maybe not the need, the recommendation to fully upgrade a plane before you get to the next level, especially from like tier 5 and up, where the next tier up you're going to be spending a decent amount of time on. You might as well make the grind on the next tier up that much better. What I was going to mention is something that I don't think we've mentioned yet is, although I was mentioning about the speed for the P-51D was not anything to anything that we need to put a gold star on or anything like that. The way that the Mustang line maintains its speed, I think, and there's no stat on this, but when I played this line, I specifically remember how easily I was able to keep my momentum, how easily I was able to keep my top speed, even if I was just leveled off. Whereas in the 109s or the MiG line, the Japanese lines for sure, they tended to kind of bleed speed a little bit, where the Mustangs just kind of just cruised. And so I think that's, it's not in the metrics. You're not going to see that anywhere on the tech tree or anything like that. But I
It's got
remember
that
I remember
carry
just being
through.
able to stick. Oh yeah, you'd be able to, because you mentioned it, Avolation, like getting bombers and getting heavies, and it like clicked. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. You could stick with heavies, especially if
Yeah.
they had like used their boost or something like that. You're like, you're rubbing your hands together and going, oh you
Yeah.
sucker,
Yeah.
I got
And
you.
if you've got them in a turn,
Yep.
their tail gun is probably not even going to get a look at you anyway. So all you've got is a big broadside of 2 big wings to shoot at, which is nice and easy.
Well, if they've even got a tail gunner at this tier, a lot of the tail gunners tend
Right.
to drop off, except in the bombers, of course. But that speed momentum, that the ability to maintain speed on the Mustang line, I think is something that isn't really talked about, and I think it makes this line, especially at this tier in tier 6, it's what separates this speed fighter from like the 109 and the I-220 and things like that.
Yeah.
It also has a really strong climb rate available to it. The Mustangs have really good climb rate capabilities, and that adds to that versatility. I remember there was a time the H chased one of my jet fighters up to like nearly 10,000 feet, and I'm like, what is killing me? And the H just did not care.
Doesn't quit.
No, so
Is that a segue?
I was trying to.
Oh, nice. Well, so you mentioned that, and when I first got the H, that is the first thing I recognized on it. This was back before the Pancake got nerfed. This is when you run into those 262s and you're like, what in the hell is going on? But the P-51H could stick with those planes. I was not afraid of an unnerfed Pancake because I knew that I could stick with it. It wouldn't like boom and zoom me. No. And that's that ability to maintain speed, the ability to climb, ridiculous. I think is underappreciated on this Mustang line.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Excuse me, I went to say something and then it's just shot through.
So
That's fine.
I did want to say that the P-51H tends to be kind of split in the community. I was talking with some people on the forum, and there's some people that they like it, and then there's a lot of people that say that it's underpowered, that it needs a buff. I don't think that the H needs a buff. I think it just needs to be played in the way it needs to be played to its strengths. Is really what it comes down to me.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's easy to look at these light fighters and assume that they're going to be great turn fighters, but that's not necessarily the case. And the P-51H is, of course, the king of all the Mustangs, and it can hold its own in a tier 8 battle. No worries.
So I distinctly remember when I went down this line initially, I just slogged it. Like I went through and I just was having a heck of a time. I just was like tier after tier. I'm like, just get me to the next plane. Just get me to the next plane. I want to get the F-86 Sabre. And so I was just doing it to do it, and I honestly hated him until I got to the H. And I started to recognize the speed, and it started to all click together. And this is when I learned how to fly an altitude fighter, was in this aircraft. I started paying attention to my airspeed. I started paying attention to my altitude. And when I did that, it made the previous ones easier to fly when I went back to them.
Yeah.
And I actually, when I sold the H, by the time I got done grinding and I sold the H in order to have the credits for the FJ1, it was like a hesitation of like, you treated me well. Like I didn't want to let it go. And I still, a part of me really wants to buy it back, but credits and time, right? But it was a great plane, and it felt really good once you had that moment. And maybe it's just nostalgia for me, but it is the king of the Mustang line, and it just feels more powerful. And like I said, I got chased down in a jet fighter by this thing because top airspeed on this thing is just crazy. You're getting up into upper 400s, maybe even the low 500s, just zipping around, and the altitude performance is so strong. speaking of jet fighters, let's first go to the Fury, but we're eventually going to talk about the F6U. So for the Fury, I call this thing my rocket ship, because
Yeah.
when I
Okay.
first got it, and when I got into battles, the first thing I do with an altitude aircraft is I put my nose up and I climb up to my altitude bracket
Yep.
because I don't want to accidentally be too low, because I see altitude as potential energy because you can always drop and get some
Yes.
airspeed. So get it early while you know you're safe at the spawn, and then go to where you're going to need to go and let that boost build back up. So I would kick the nose straight up, like 90 degrees, hammer the
Yeah.
boost, and with the climb rate this thing had, I would get up to my, what is it, like 8,500 feet, just straight up, level off the plane, and I'd still have a ton of speed because, like Postal said, this line tends to hold its airspeed, and I would just zip to the next target. And this is the first time you start to feel the aircraft's maneuverability get so much better, because it changes, right? This is when your altitude fighter, like the American line, starts to become less of a boom and zoom, even though it can do it. It's more of a altitude dogfighter.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a much better all-rounder.
Yeah, I
And it
definitely
doesn't
agree.
hurt that you get the top tier guns.
Well, and so I mean that's what anybody that doesn't like this plane or the P-51H or the Sabre at tier 10 doesn't like it because you've still got the same 50 cals. I mean, they're not the same that you've had the whole line, but they're basically the same that you've had the whole line. They've got a little bit
Yeah.
more range and a little bit more damage. And so people are like, well, where the hell's my 37 mil on a MiG, or where's my 420 mils on the 1092? Where's my oomph? And I don't think they recognize that if your guns aren't getting better, everything else on the plane's getting better. Your airspeed is you're fast
Right.
as heck, right? Your maneuverability for an altitude fighter is ridiculous. You can outturn anything that's if you're playing to your altitude, you can outturn anything. You're basically the yak of 10,000 feet.
Yes.
And then your altitude performance is actually higher than every other fighter at this tier. You're higher than the MiG. You're higher than that 1092. So you can determine the engagement. And I think people miss that from time to time when they're talking about the
Right.
FJ1.
Yeah. I was just thinking before how I think that they've got this line right. It's just not a beginner line. Like, the Spitfire is a great beginner line. This one, you can't do those the turn fights the way that you expect. You do have to learn to manage your energy. And yeah, I was just looking at the stats compared from my 51H to the FJ1. I don't have the Fury as spec'd out as I do the Mustang, but the airspeed on the Mustang is actually superior to that of the Fury at the moment.
Yeah.
Specialization for the win. They say
Yeah.
that a specialization adds about a tier to a tier and a half depending on equipment. So you
Yeah.
might as well be in a 9.5 with your P51H, which is an awesome thing to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah,
potential.
and I was actually just thinking about that as well. Like the barrier for entry for this line is not your beginner line. This is something you do after you've done like your Spitfire line or even a BF-109 line, which is obviously more forgiving and more consistent. And
Yes.
then you come over here because of the nostalgia. But so many people want a Mustang. So many
Mhm.
people want the F-86 because of what it was and what it represented in World War II. Like in World War II, the P-51H is what allowed the bombing campaigns to get to where they needed to be in Europe. So that's the thing everybody thinks of. It's the fastest aircraft. It's the one that got close to breaking the sound barrier, but they didn't realize it in level flight when it started getting the buffeting. The F-86 Sabre was the king of Korea with the first like jet dogfight engagements. So people want those based on that idea, that concept. But if you can't get past the game characteristics, like the flight characteristics, you're gonna hate the rest of the line. And I think that's where it gets its bad name from. And it does feel like you're tickling people to death a lot of the time.
Death by
Yeah.
1,000 paper cuts is how I how I think of it. And you both touched on it a little bit. I just want to reinforce it. Like this line, the reason it gets a bad rap is because it's not forgiving. The Spitfire, you can make mistakes in a Spitfire and you can overcome those mistakes. Even a BF-109, once you've learned, the basic mechanics of the game. But this line, if you make a mistake, it's typically fatal. Because your engagement, you're not at a high enough speed, or you're trying to outturn something that you can't outturn. The FJ1, has a little bit of flexibility when it comes to maneuverability, but its mistakes on this line are punished a lot harder than they are on some of the other fighter lines.
Yeah,
That is for sure. So to completely divert, just because we're kind of on like this track of the FJ1, and I think the F86 falls very close to the FJ1. But now that they've reorganized the tech tree, Posa, let's talk a little bit about your one of your favorite aircraft in the game, just because it changes. It's the other American fighter that, for the longest time, was the one that was ignored because it was a choice between this and the F-94D back in the old tech tree, and it's an easy choice. The F-94D gets a Vulcan. Like, who doesn't want a Vulcan in air-to-air rockets?
Exactly.
But the F-6U Pirate, now arguably in the right place in the tech tree, and an easy entry to jot over into the American heavy fighter line, which is a great line to go down. The F-6U trades the maneuverability for increased burst speed and a set of tier 10 20 millimeter cannons. So you get your cannon flavors. So this is be an opportunity at the P-51H. If you've decided, I don't like this line, you can jot over to this aircraft and easily access the heavy fighter line. Like, this is a nice exit route, or it's just a nice ability to get ahead on another tech tree. And the F-6U, I think, was an underloved aircraft by a lot of people because of the F-94D option. But I found that once you got this thing kind of synced up, even though it doesn't have the best altitude performance, it's pretty good. And the acceleration, the overall airspeed, the ability to hold that airspeed, and having a monster amount of firepower. This has the same guns as the F-2H Banshee, its same tier counterpart heavy fighter, but it has more maneuverability and about the same airspeed, and it's just a real beast once you start to understand that boom and zoom tactic. So it does kind of bring over a little bit of the flavor of the previous aircraft, but it definitely is not meant to maneuver. Not meant to maneuver at all.
No.
Yeah, and if you keep that mentality of the inability to maneuver, and because as you're going down the Mustang line, you're getting a little bit more maneuverability, The F-6U throws that all out the window for like a ridiculous amount of airspeed. I mean, I got this back in the day when it was available on the multi-role tech tree, and the only reason I got it, honestly, was because there was, I think it was March of Nations or something like that, where it was on discount, and I was like, well, I might as well get it because it's cheaper, and I'm a cheapie. And I got it, and I just absolutely fell in love with it so quickly. I was like, wait a minute. I played a few games, and I'm like, wait a minute, something's wrong. Like, this is probably just like noob kind of games, you figure first few games, but you're right. It's basically a rocket with some wings. It goes so fast, and you can't play it like a fighter, though. I think people look at that little symbol and they say, okay, it's a fighter. It's really just a heavy fighter assassin, and you dive down on multi-roles and fighters. It can take out bombers and ground attack planes very quickly because those guns that you mentioned, V, are so strong. They're the same guns as a heavy fighter. So this plane, I just absolutely love it. I'll never get rid of this thing. It's not like the Mustangs, but it's been an absolute joy for me to play, for sure.
It's got almost double the damage output there for the FJ1.
Yep.
One thing I will say about the Mustang and the Sabre guns is that you can keep that trigger held down 2 to 3, 4 times longer than any other plane. Like, that is actually a pretty good feature sometimes when your aim is not so great, but you can just keep peppering away and you don't have to worry about the guns overheating. So it's
You bring up a good
yeah.
point. We haven't mentioned that at all, and I think that's yeah. I think honestly, you saying 2 to 3 to 4 times probably is an understatement. I've been able to hold the just hold it down for like 60 seconds straight, and you're like, oh man, I overheated. Wow, I didn't even know that could let me let off the trigger here.
Could do that, yeah. I've managed to wipe out sort of 2 targets without stopping shooting.
And they cool off pretty quick too, which is nice.
They do.
With this F6U, you overheat those cannons and you feel it, like you gotta wait. And you're like, all right, I'll come back in a minute. So, yeah, but the F6U, I think it was important to mention that this does exist. It does come off the tech tree, and it is a really nice way to hop into the top tier American heavy fighters if you are interested in doing that. So it might be worth your time to spend a bit of effort in the P-51H in order to get over here. With that said, let's go to the F-86 Sabre, the culmination of this line, something that I'm sure everybody when they start a line, they look at the aircraft in the line, but they immediately go to the tier 10 and they go, what am I going to get at the end if I actually put the effort in? And this is the aircraft. This is the king of high altitude dogfighting. It is really good maneuverability. The one I have isn't even specialized, but with a 9.4 second turn time and with my configuration, that's going to outturn every other altitude fighter that's out there. Obviously, if it's specialized and gone crazy with it, I could get outturned by other aircraft, but it is a nasty aircraft with some really good roll characteristics and really good airspeed as well. It's not the best, but it's pretty dang good, and it feels like it's. People say, I wish we could have the one with the 20mm cannons, because there is an F-86 with 20s. That would be overpowered. That would be unfair. This I feel is balanced.
Right.
Yeah. For the game, you're right. If this had 20mm cannons, it would be an MEP 1101 that can outmaneuver everything and go faster and have higher altitude performance. So, it would just be overpowered. It honestly needs the 50 cals on this, or else you would just literally own everything.
Yes, it's nuts. And if you're moving your pilot forward, I didn't even have my full pilot on here. I've got like a 15-point pilot on this guy, and the maneuverability drops down to 9.1. And that's not
specialized.
Yeah, and you put on pneumatic control assist like we've been doing lately, and now you've got an aircraft that could theoretically cause some serious problems with your LA-15s and stuff like that, because we thought the LA-15 was really maneuverable with a 9.6 turn time.
Yeah.
And this F-86 can actually bring it to bear. And we talked about the guns. If you can find an aircraft that is in a bad energy state, that's stalled out, or is just stationary with a wide cross section, a light fighter you can eliminate in a single pass with these guns.
Yeah.
It's totally possible once you get it synced in and you know what you're doing. I like to personally, if I'm trailing on somebody that's engaging another target, I don't fire as soon as the numbers turn red. I wait till I get to about 1,000 feet, or what would probably be about 300 meters. Once you get to that range and you unload, now you're ensuring more of those shells hit, and you're gonna tear things apart before they can react. Because if you gotta tickle somebody to death, you might as well get in there so you can ensure that you're getting the full damage potential early on, because once they start maneuvering, then it becomes more of a slog.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry.
I was just going to say, like you say, VeeBat, it really can pack a punch as you go close range. And if you combine that with your altitude and the crazy bonus that you get from diving, not only in speed but actual damage output as well, if you combine all that, you can definitely knock something out in one pass.
Yeah, one thing that I think is under talked about, but that's not even a phrase. Something that isn't talked about is the actual speed of this plane. Granted, the cruise speed isn't anything special. The MiG-15, things like the Swift, of course, are going to outpace it, but its boost speed has the ability to get up there significant, like higher than the Swift in the MiG-15. So that means that you can go from 0 to 100, so to speak, really, really quickly. And sometimes when you need to be mindful of that when you are trying to get on target to somebody. There's been a handful of times where I go zipping by somebody because I'm just going so freaking fast, and this plane can do that. And kind of like the FJ1 before it, the guns aren't, the metrics on the guns aren't getting any better, so that means everything else is getting that much better. If your guns aren't jumping up in performance, the airspeed, the maneuverability, the altitude performance, all of that is going to be compensated by having the same guns. And to me, I actually appreciated that because I was like, well, I know how to use these guns. I've used them the whole freaking line. Now I'm going from something that was, very quick in the Mustangs. I'm still maintaining that speed, but now I've got this maneuverability that I wasn't relying on before. Now I
Yep.
can utilize that, and it just makes this plane feel so strong. If you succeeded with the Mustangs, you're gonna absolutely love the Sabre.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's interesting to mention this because I think the undisputed #1 altitude fighter in most of people's opinion is going to be your Germans, right? Either the 1092 or the 1101, like the 1101 for Tier 10, because it has, what is it, 800 damage, cumulative damage, which allows it to really be able to burst down things. But those guns overheat really quick, and the airframe isn't nearly as nimble as the F-86. We've already mentioned how the airframes on this line are really what bring it into its own. So I think a skilled F-86 pilot can give an 1101 or even the FJ1 pilot can give a 1092 a really good run for their money. And I think that's something to bear in mind, that while those are going to be the easiest planes to fly, I think if you put the time, effort, and energy into this line, I think you can find yourself coming out on top, especially if you don't instantly factor in that it's a loss because you're going up against the meta plane.
Well, and yeah, you will run into a lot of specialized 1092s and 1101s, but I tend to think of it this way. Their base airspeed, maneuverability, and altitude performance is going to be less than your base on a Sabre. Their guns are better, obviously, and so they're specializing their planes to get a little bit more maneuverability and more airspeed and yada, yada, yada. But you've already got a better base metric for every single one of those stats.
Yeah.
And so as long as you're, granted, they've got those 20 mils on there, as long as you're aware of them being in the zone, there's no reason that you can't take the steps to, getting rid of them. When I talked about the F6U being like an anti-heavy fighter, the F-86A is honestly, it's an anti-fighter fighter. Anything that's up in your altitude bracket that's a fighter, you're going to be able to outmaneuver, and you might not be able to necessarily outspeed them, but you're going to be able to stay with them. They can't outspeed you, I guess is what I should say.
You're going to be able to keep up.
Yeah, MiG-15, maybe a Swift might be able to get away from you, but a MiG-15, an 1101, things of that nature aren't going to be able to get away from you, and a Swift is going to take a little while to actually get away from you in a Sabre.
And even though the 50 cals don't have a high crit chance, they're more of a fire chance, you can get that crit with enough volume that if you can isolate those targets, you can knock out an engine, a pilot, a wing, you find yourself getting that advantage. And as long as you can keep your guns on them and keep their guns off you, you're going to find yourself winning a lot of those engagements, especially if you're coming up from underneath or diving down on top. We don't talk about this a lot, but the human mind wants to think in 2 dimensions, and when you introduce this third axis, your z-axis, people don't know how to necessarily handle it innately. It's an acquired skill. So if you can take advantage of that, coming up from underneath or diving down on top of people, one, you're going to be getting a bigger target because you're going to get a wide cross section, and 2, you can be able to get the jump on them and get those guns within that range we talked about. So
Yeah. There are a lot of planes, like especially in this Mustang line, where you can use that climb rate and that speed to counter a dogfight. You can climb instead of turn, and they're going to struggle to keep their nose pointed at you because turning is one thing for them, that's no worries. But when you add the engine component into it, it's a different ballgame.
Yeah, good point. Just slightly putting my nose up in one of the Mustangs, P51H is a prime example, putting my nose up a little bit and engaging the boost, and you just kind of wave to whatever might be behind you, especially a Spitfire or something like that. Like, yeah, you might have been behind me, but you're not going to be behind me for very long because I'm going to be pulling away, and you don't have that momentum and you don't have that engine power to keep up.
Yep.
All right, so we hit it A to Z, but what I thought was nice about this recording, guys, is it felt very much like people aren't necessarily in the chat while we're like going through all this, but when we play just casually, like on Flight Up Friday or just flying with Avolation, like these are the conversations we have maybe on one or two planes while we're waiting for a battle or picking an aircraft. It's just, I figured if we were going to do a showcase, it would be easier to just kind of wrap like we normally do and just record it. So hopefully this format is what people are looking for and people enjoy it. I mean, it's a long recording, but I feel like some good information got put out, and an opinion of 3 different people. Granted, we like this line, but I think we gave it a good, honest review between the 3 of us and our opinions and how we approach the game. So,
well, if we like the line, then there's a reason why we like the line, and there's an approach that we have with the planes that make us enjoy it. It's not just the nostalgia, although, like a lot of people, I went down this line because the Mustang's awesome looking, and I remember the history of it. But we enjoyed it because we did well in it, and we learned from what the strengths and the weaknesses of the airframes were and what we could do with it. And I think if we enjoy a line, we're able to talk about that and its impact, and hopefully our perspective, although some of our perspectives were right in line with each other, our perspectives will allow people to say, oh, you know what, I didn't think of using the plane in that manner, or I didn't think of it from that perspective, and help other people enjoy this line like we do.
Yeah, I definitely wish I had heard this recording when I started playing.
I can empathize with that one. Yeah, and for that, I highly recommend anybody watching this video that's struggling with this line to go check out a review on one of our channels, or Avolation just has a couple of mashups. You might be able to find some of these airframes, and of course we should be compiling all of our recordings for each one of these airframes so you can see us using them, but checking out how we've used the aircraft to good success, because typically we're showcasing some of our better games and therefore the better tactics and what's worked for us, so you can get some ideas. So check out Postal Monkey's page linked in the description below, as well as Avolation from Avolation Industries, and see what he's got available as well, because there are some tactics that come with this line that are going to make it more enjoyable. It's not going to be your typical yank and bang turn fighter. It's something that's going to take a little bit more nuance, skill, and finesse in order to get to
patience is a word I would use.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right, with that said, guys, thanks for joining me for doing this recording. Hopefully it's a sign of things to come and we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
You guys have a good one. Later.